So just to give you an overview of the kind of profiles that we have, here are a few statistics on display, so you can look at the kind of scores that we have, and it will give you a general idea of when we talk about the colleges that we get into. You have a general idea about what kind of profiles we had, and you can follow this up by looking up profiles on Yocket and Grad Cafe, and that will also give you another idea about what kind of profiles get accepted into what colleges. So for the new people who have just joined us, please keep yourself muted throughout the session. And if you have any questions, please note them down, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the whole webinar. And there's no need to note down anything on these slides because we'll be sharing them with you through a drive link, and we'll share that through the WhatsApp group that we've created. So there's no need to note down anything on these slides. So moving on, you can see that these are the names of some colleges that we've been admitted into. They are spread out among different countries and different kind of programs as well. So some of the top rank colleges would be TU Delft, RWT Chaffin, University of Alberta, and C Boulder. So based on our profiles, we have gotten into some of the all of these colleges that are on display here, and we have applied to a lot more. So this will give you an idea about the kind of countries and different kind of courses that we've applied to, and we'll talk about that further on in the webinar. So we'll start with the basics of what we will cover during this particular webinar. Siddharth?
Yeah, I'll take it from here. Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. So today over the next hour or so, we'll just give you pointers and tips about the whole application process and sort of what was our experience and what we took away from it. And hopefully that'll help you guys when you're applying. So we'll basically cover the application process and how you sort of shortlist colleges and decide what sort of program you want to apply for, what factors you could take into consideration when shortlisting universities and everything. And obviously after that, a major part of the application process is the exams like GRE and TOEFL and IELTS and everything. So any pointers that we have, we'll be sharing those with you, and also any material that we have, we'll be sharing all those resources through the Drive link. So don't worry about that. Then probably the most important part of the application would be the SOP, LOR, and the CV, because that is where the admissions committee really gets to know you as a person and your motivation for choosing this course or this university and what your ambitions are exactly. So those are probably three of the most important things that you have to take care of, and we'll speak about that in a while. Then after that, again, funding, including loans and scholarships that government agencies offer, as well as the universities, and a basic look at the expenses, because it is quite a very costly thing to not only attend but also even to just apply to universities. It is relatively expensive, so we'll just give you a run through of that. And after that, the job prospects and the co-op programs that are usually held in the US universities. And the visa process, right now everything's up in the air and it's sort of uncertain. So again, that is something that that is quite nerve-wracking for most people. So we'll try to give you an overview of the visa process and how it could be in the next few years. And probably the most overlooked part of the entire process, which is actually networking with the college and networking with alumni and professors, which you may not think adds much of a weightage, but it does help you sort of boost your profile a little. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session to answer any questions that you have regarding what we've spoken about. So let's begin with the application budget. So as I said, even before you apply for colleges, you need to sort of have all these things in place. So the GRE test, I'm sure that all of you are aware of it, that it is mostly required by most universities, and it is quite expensive. It's around $213, which in the current conversion rate comes to around 15,000 Indian rupees. The IELTS is another 14,000 Indian rupees. The TOEFL is around, I'd say, a similar amount, probably 13 to 14,000 rupees. And GRE scores, once you get your scores, you're supposed to send them directly from the testing agency to the university. So even for that, there is an additional charge beyond the first 4 universities that you send to. So that again is an additional cost of 27 USD per university. And yeah, and each university, once you submit the application, there is an application fee that you have to pay. And it is, on average, it's around $70 to $80 for the American universities. Some of the higher ranked universities, say like Berkeley, would have a fee of around $120 to $140. So it depends on the universities, and some of them have a lower fee of around $40. So, but on average, you'd probably have to factor in around $80 per college. So most people tend to apply to 8 to 10 colleges. So it amounts to around 600 USD, which is an additional like 40,000 rupees. So overall, on average, the budget to just apply for universities and meet these basic requirements of GRE and your English proficiency score and everything would come to around this amount. And obviously, it varies based on which countries you're applying to, because say universities in the UK and Europe, they may have free application and stuff like that. So it varies, but generally this is what it costs for that. Moving on. Yeah, and so given the flow chart, so obviously it is a very lengthy process, something that you start very early on in your final year or even before that, preparing for the exams and everything. Obviously, the first part is you need to sort of decide what sort of programs you're interested in, what countries you want to apply to, what colleges you feel you'd fit into. So we'll speak about that in a while, but yeah, that is the first process. And once you've sort of shortlisted universities and programs that you find interesting, then it's just about making a note of filtering out these universities and colleges based on certain factors that you have in mind. And there could be anything from job prospects after graduating to how easy it is to stay in the country or get a work visa after you graduate, to the culture of the place, or or the weather there. So it could be absolutely anything, and it's unique for each person. And booking a slot for the GRE and preparing for that is again a process. I'd say most people take around 2 to 3 months to prepare for the GRE and everything. So you need to factor that in as well. So we'd suggest you sort of start preparing towards the end of your third year or in the summer between your third and final year. And after that, as I said, probably the most important part of the application, and something that the admissions committees do go over multiple times, will be your SOP, which is your statement of purpose, the letter of recommendation from your professors or supervisors and people like that, and obviously your resume or your CV. And we'll talk about that in a while. And yeah, each university has a set of common documents that they ask for, but some have other additional stuff that they require, and that would vary based on each university. But on typically it would just be your passport and or some visa details and your grade sheets from college and stuff like that. Nothing too out of the ordinary. And yeah, always keeping the deadlines in mind and everything is a very strenuous process. So do make sure to sort of have everything ready in hand well before the deadline, so that even if something is missing or you need to, uh, you know, you need to add something else to your application, you have enough time. You brought yourself enough time to do that and not mess up, so you have a complete application. And after that, the LORs, once you've sort of given your recommenders details and everything, you'll have to get them to submit the letter through a link that they'll receive on their email and all of that. So do like stay in touch with whoever your recommenders are. And probably the most nerve-wracking, gut-wrenching part of the whole process would be actually waiting for the admissions. So once you've actually submitted your application, there's nothing much you can do. You've done your best. And so that is the part that is probably the most strenuous for most people. So apart from that, you can also use it to network with other alumni and professors of the department, which may sort of give you an advantage in the future. And in the end, once you receive your admits and admit letters and everything, then starts the whole process of getting your funding ready, and you'll be in continuous correspondence with the university and the program for any other requirements they have, including grade sheets that you'll have to get from the college, the official transcripts, then enrolling and registering for classes and all of that. So this is just an overview of the entire application process. We'll sort of start going into detail of each step now. So the first part, as I said, shortlisting universities. I think I'd be safe to say that, you know, most people, I guess, they have a hard time sort of figuring out what they actually want to study or what they actually want to pursue. Even when you come towards your senior year and you're sort of at the beginning of the application cycle and everything. And at least that was the case for me. I was sort of confused about which direction to go in. So I'm sure everyone has a different experience, and maybe Abdus and Rudraksh can sort of tell their experience. But for me, what sort of worked was I looked at what was my ultimate career goal, let's say, or ambition, and I sort of worked backwards from that. So what I need to do to get there. So that is when I started sort of thinking about sticking to my core area and sort of building further upon that, instead of maybe going to something like data science or something that isn't directly related to my undergraduate field of education. So that is how I sort of narrowed down on the program that I wanted. And after that, it was just looking at different universities, because although if you go to any website and look at, say, the best programs for electrical and computer engineering, you'd get, you know, probably the same list of universities like MIT, Berkeley, Stanford, Cornell, and, you know, but obviously those are very ambitious colleges. And I think the most important thing is to be self-aware and like be ambitious, but at the same time know what sort of colleges to aim for. I don't mean to discourage anyone, but like I knew that because of my profile, I'd have to aim slightly lower than so the sort of quote unquote dream colleges. So you should sort of understand where your profile lies in the grand scheme of things, and also shortlist colleges based on that. There are like multiple factors, as I said, that can come into consideration when you're shortlisting the universities. So number one for me was just the sort of faculty and what was their reputation, let's say, in industry. And most of the universities that I applied to, I sort of just go through the profiles of the people in the department and look at what sort of research they're doing. Probably look up the name on Google Scholar or something, and you'll find a few papers, or you might find a topic that they're working on that you find interesting. So be sure to like write to them and say that you're applying and you find this interesting and stuff like that. So that was one sort of criteria that I had in mind. Then the second one, which is probably not as important, but as an international student, you'll sort of have to factor that in, which would be the sort of ranking and reputation of the university, because getting a job and converting your student visa into a work visa, that still does sort of depend on the caliber of university that you come from. So do keep that in mind as well. Thirdly, of course, it was the cost, because it is quite an expensive thing to study abroad. So cost again sort of factored in, where some programs may have been in reach, but they were extremely expensive. And so we decided to sort of maybe take a back foot on that. And lastly, yeah, I guess probably something that most people wouldn't tell you is how does that university, what is the sort of lifestyle that students live in that university and in the city that the college is based in, because in your graduate programs you'd spend say 40 to 50% of your time maybe in class and in labs and interacting with professors and stuff like that, but the rest of the time you'll have to be doing stuff to sort of outside the classroom and outside the department to sort of strengthening your profile and interacting with people, networking, and obviously like sort of enjoying the entire experience of having a graduate education. So those are the four sort of main criterias I had in mind, me especially, and it varies from person to person. So once you've sort of narrowed down those universities, do make like a spreadsheet of those universities with the program name and all the details that are sort of relevant to that. It could be when the deadline is for application, when the results come out, the link to the application portal, the requirements of documents, including what GRE score they require, what is the minimum GPA, what is the sort of they have different codes as well for you to send the scores, including the GRE, the TOEFL, and the IELTS. So note those down as well, because when you write the exam, you'll have to give those codes if you want to send the scores for free. So include all sort of details that would be required. And we've made spreadsheets of our own during the process. So we have those in the drive as well that we'll be sharing with you. So you can sort of get an idea of how we did that. And yeah, lastly, most people apply to around 10 to 12 colleges on average. And as I said before, it is good to aim high as well, but also know where your profile lies in the grand scheme. So I'd say a good number, if you're applying to 10 colleges, would be a good ratio would be to have 3 ambitious schools, 4 moderate schools, and probably 3 safe schools, which you're pretty sure that you'd get into. So that gives a nice balance of, like schools that you think you'd fit in at. And yeah, so keep that ratio, because I guess most people either aim too high sometimes or probably aim too low and miss out on a possible opportunity at a better university. So for me, at least, that's what I did. So if you guys have any questions about shortlisting and anything, you guys can ask that in the end and we'll answer. But for now, we'll move on. Rudraksh will take over for the GRE and TOEFL.
Yeah, hi guys. So the GRE is basically like an entrance test, but the key thing here is that not all programs will require it. And especially with COVID this year, a lot of programs had waived this requirement. So they didn't even consider GRE scores. But going ahead, I think once COVID settles down, the GRE will be back. So we're just going to give you some information about how to best prepare for the GRE. So it's basically a quantitative and verbal test. So there's basically 3 sections. It has maths, English, and writing. So so the best ways to prepare for the GRE are basically this YouTube channel, Greg Matt, and he also has a website. So that's the one, like the best resource that I found to study for this test. Now, along with that, there's obviously also the official ETS books. The ETS is the testing agency. They have 3 books. One is the guide, which has all the information you need about the GRE. So you can refer to that for all the up-to-date information. And along with that, they also have 2 workbooks that have 150 questions each of each type of section. And then so the main thing for maths is basically just practicing. Abdus, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so for maths, I would say the best thing is to just practice. And the thing is, the maths level is very easy. The toughest thing about the GRE is actually managing your time, because you have to be really fast. You have to answer, I think, 20 questions in half an hour. So you can't spend too much time thinking over a question, and you are allowed to go back and forth. So the best thing would be to attempt all the ones you can quickly, and then go back and do the rest as quick as possible. So the best way to prepare for that is this book on the left side, the Manhattan 5-pound book, which has, I think, thousands of questions, and it has verbal as well, but I would suggest this book only for the quantitative. And for verbal, the official books are the best source. Now, along with that, the verbal section really relies a lot on vocabulary. So you really need to know like maybe 500 words that you would never use in normal conversation, but you need to know their meanings because some of them may show up on the test. And the only way to answer those questions would be to know the meaning of the words. Now, for this, the best way to prepare, there's this flashcards app on iOS and Android. It's called Magoosh GRE flashcards. So that has, I think, 6 packs of 50 words each. And if you memorize all those words, it should be enough to clear the test. Now, I'm just going to go back once. Yeah, so as for preparation time, I would say that if you have 2 months of like diligent work and you sit every day and you study for maybe 1 hour, 2 hours, I think 2 months is enough to study. And if that's not possible, if you're like in the semester or if during the summer of your 3rd year, which is when I did it, if you had an internship or something, then ideally you might need maybe 3 months or 4 months. But the thing is, you should target to finish the test well in advance of when you want to apply. So if you're going to apply for fall 2022, then ideally you should have your GRE scores ready by the summer or at max maybe September or October, because then you can focus on the other important parts of your application. Yeah, then go ahead, Devdus. Yeah, so for practicing the GRE, like the best way to practice the test is actually to do some practice tests. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of tests available online, but in my opinion, I think the best source is the official ETS material, and especially when it comes to the verbal section. So that's why I said the Manhattan 5-pound book is good for maths, because maths is the same everywhere. But the thing is, these other companies, they can't really make the same types of questions that the testing agency makes. So for that, I would recommend verbal. You should only trust the official ETS material. And there's only a few official tests available. So like you can see down here, there's 7 and 3 of them are paid, which is like $20 US each. So if you really want that extra preparation, you can maybe buy one of those. But I would suggest you definitely do the 2 in the official guidebook and the 2 free online tests. Now, the online ones are very important because the actual test is also going to be on the computer. And the online test is in the exact same format as the actual test. So you'll have, it'll be in the exact same order as well. So first you'll do the writing on your keyboard. Then you'll have to attempt the entire quiz in the exact given time on your computer. So it'll be emulating the exact environment of the test. So those are the best ones. And if you, like I said, if you really want to go ahead and prepare some more, then you can buy one of the paid tests. Now, I would suggest that if you are going to do this, then you buy the 3rd one because that's the latest version. So it's always good to prepare with that. Yeah. Next slide. Right. So we've also prepared, because we're going to, like Abdus had mentioned, we're going to be making these slides available to you. You can have a look at these FAQs. I'll just go through some of the important ones, but you'll have the slides. So you can go through some of the questions and get your questions answered. So like I said, the test is on the computer. And the good thing about the GRE is in most places, I mean, I don't know if I think COVID has definitely affected this, but usually the GRE is offered a lot of times. Now, the only limit is you can do it 5 times in a year, like 5 times in a continuous 12-month period. And you have to wait 21 days between tests. So I think even if you do require repeated attempts, like you should be fine. Yeah, and so the scores are valid for 5 years. And yeah, so next slide of this. So right now, because of COVID, there's also the at-home option of the GRE. I don't know. I think it's still active, and I think for the coming months, maybe even the starting of next year, it might still be a thing. But I would suggest if you have the option, do not do the online, I mean, the at-home test, because I've seen a lot of cases where the system just crashes, and then the testing agency tells you that your scores have been canceled because of malpractice, and they don't even refund you the money. So if it's possible, if it's safe for you to do so, I strongly suggest that you go do it at a testing agency. Now, coming to the scores, you'll get the scores in 10 to 15 days. And another thing is, at the end of the test, they'll ask you if you want to cancel your scores or if you want to report your scores. Like Abdus had mentioned, you get 4 free tests to send, and you select that at the end of the test. Now, if you think that you did really badly and you want to cancel your scores, don't cancel them, because even if you did badly, you can send your better scores to university later, and you might have actually performed better than you think. So just when they ask you if you want to cancel your scores, don't say, like, just don't cancel them. It's always a good idea to have your scores in hand. Yeah. Now, as I said, the best time to start preparing would be to, if you're in your third year right now, or if your third year just finished, I feel like you can use the summer, utilize it well, and try to give the GRE maybe in September or October. September if you want, like, to give yourself more time to prepare. Yeah, and now what is a good score for the GRE? It's actually like it's very program dependent. So the thing is, most like elite universities above 330, they don't really see a distinction. Like if you have 330 and someone has 335, it's like basically the same thing for them. Then they'll more focus on stuff like the SOP or your GPA, stuff like that. Yeah, now do all places require GRE? Again, this is also program specific. So especially with COVID, there's been a lot of changes in who requires the GRE. Okay, next slide. Right. So since I give TOEFL, I'll be speaking about TOEFL, and then Abdus can take over for IELTS. So TOEFL is conducted by the same agency as the GRE, and it has 4 parts. It has reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And I think one of the key differences between TOEFL and IELTS is that the speaking for TOEFL is to a computer. Like your voice will just be recorded. Like they'll give you a 45-second window, and you have to speak. It'll be recorded, and then it'll be sent to the testing agency. Whereas in IELTS, there'll be an actual person that you speak with. Yeah, and most, like, both of these tests, all they're doing is just testing your English speaking and, I mean, your English skills basically. So they're pretty straightforward. The only thing is you should be able, like, I'd say if English is not your strong language, then you might need more time to prepare. But if you're comfortable with English, it's not really a hassle. And the thing is, most places just require you to get above the minimum. Like they don't care if you get 110 or 120. Yeah, Abdus, can you take over for IELTS?
Yeah, so for IELTS, the whole as Rudak says, the exam is very simple, but the only difference is that for the speaking session, you'll have a conversation with an actual person. So that makes it a little easier, I would say, because then there's a back and forth conversation with the person, and we're more used to that than speaking into a mic and recording ourselves. The other thing that I would say is IELTS is a little cheaper because, as I mentioned, that for ETS, all of the exams that you take, you have to send the scores to the universities. So for IELTS, sending the scores is cheaper, and most universities will just accept the PDF that they give you for the score sheet. So that makes it a little cheaper than TOEFL in the overall scheme of things. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I'll speak about TOEFL material. So there's an official guide for the TOEFL, which is very long, and I feel like it's not, like, it's too big a read. Like it just has very basic information, and it just takes a lot of time. So I would suggest going to YouTube and checking out this channel called Target Test Prep. So that's what I used, and it had all the information, like the basic thing about the test. It had some practice tests as well, and I think overall it's just a really good resource. Right. Now, like we did in the GRE FAQ, like this is also the TOEFL and IELTS FAQ. So here you can see that the test is again on the computer. And again, it's offered almost like the same as GRE, but this time the limit is less. You can wait 3 days between tests. So it's not really an issue. The problem here is that the scores for IELTS and TOEFL are both only valid for 2 years. Right, of this? 2 years, I think.
Yeah, for both, it's just 2 years.
Yeah. Right. Again, so best time to start preparing, I would say like focus on GRE first, and then head over to IELTS or TOEFL, because the thing is, as you're preparing for the GRE, because the GRE also has a reading section in the verbal, and it also requires you to know some vocabulary. I feel like once you're prepared for the GRE, then preparing for the TOEFL or IELTS would be generally easier. Now, the thing is with TOEFL, you have the option to send your best scores. Is that also the case in IELTS, Abdus?
Yeah, you have the option, but more or less, it's not exactly sending scores. You just upload the PDF for the
The
scorecard that you
PDF,
have.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are just like the small administrative differences between those two. And again, like I said, the good score for both of them is basically you need to clear the minimum, and then after that, they don't really make a distinction. Yeah. Now, most places will require TOEFL and IELTS because we're all international students. I mean, I'm talking about the US and Canada. I don't know about Europe, but for US and Canada, most places do require either the TOEFL or IELTS. But some places they might like specify. Some programs might only want the IELTS, and then some places might only want the TOEFL. So if that's the case, and you really want to apply to that program, what you can do is, if you're an NIT Warangal student and you have like, let's say you have the TOEFL and you didn't give the IELTS, but that college is only asking for the IELTS, you can email the admissions committee and you can tell them that you've given the TOEFL, and on the back of your semester mark sheets, if you see, it says that English is the medium of instruction at NIT Warangal. So those two things should be enough for them to waive the requirement for you. But that's only if you have one of the tests. Yeah, so like I said, you should just check with the program if you have any doubts about this.
Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to say was that usually people tend not to score in the writing sections. So just focus a little more on the listening sections because that's easier to score. And as Rudrak said, the same thing goes for IELTS. You have like 4 different parts and you get a band score in each of them. And then the average of all of that is your overall band score. So you just need to have like minimum of, I think it's 6.5 in most of them. And that's pretty easy to score. So I don't think you need to worry too much about any of these tests.
Right, okay. Siddharth will take over this part.
Yeah, so now we'll just sort of break down probably the most like famous regions that people apply to. I'll be speaking about the US, Rudraksh will speak about Canada, and Abdus will speak about UK and the rest of Europe. So for the US, I guess this US is the place that sort of most people prefer. So if you're applying for a STEM program, if you look at any sort of rankings or anything over the last few years, the top colleges would normally be these like MIT, Stanford, any of the University of California system colleges, Georgia Tech, Cornell, University of Michigan, Carnegie Mellon, and a few more as well. But obviously, apart from the rankings, as we said, there is a lot of stuff that you need to take into account. So it depends entirely on you and what it is you're looking for in your graduate study experience. So don't get too swayed by rankings. It is an important factor, but once you narrow down on a college, then maybe like check the ranking of the program, the ranking of the university, and how it does in terms of faculty and research output and stuff like that. So don't get too swayed by rankings in the initial stages, and sort of make sure that you're able to find a university that you feel is a good fit for you. So that is the main thing about US. After that, once you receive your student visa, which is the F1 visa, which will be for 2 years for a STEM program, there is an option for STEM graduates to sort of extend the stay up to 3 years beyond the end of the course date. So if you're starting in fall 2022 and your program ends in 2024, you can convert your visa into this OPT visa for an additional 3 years. So the whole point of this visa is for you to be able to find a job while staying in the country and eventually convert that into a H-1B visa, which is the sort of work visa that you require to live there. As of now, it is a kind of difficult process. A lot of people do end up coming back after the 3 years because they are not able to convert it to the work visa. But it is now slowly starting to become easier because the Biden administration does want to attract people from US and China and Europe to the US. So they're sort of trying to make the entire process easier. So do try to keep in touch with, like, whichever place you're applying to, do try and follow the news regarding immigration and student visa and work visa updates from the government agencies and stuff, because it does keep changing very regularly. And because of COVID as well, there'd be other restrictions in the future. So do sort of keep an eye on that continuously. Coming to the living expenses and basically the cost of attending, it is much more expensive compared to Europe and Canada. So the living expenses again vary by city. Some place like if you say LA or New York, if you apply to NYU or UCLA or something like that, the living expenses would obviously be much higher as compared to a smaller university or a university in a town like say University of Wisconsin or something that is in a smaller town, and so living expenses are generally lower. So we'll give you a sort of breakdown of that later on. And yeah, the tuition fee, mostly it is per credit rather than per semester. So in the US, you're usually required to do around 30 credits during your program. So each university has a cost per credit that they charge you for, and it's around, I'd say, $2,000 per credit. And some universities have a per semester charge based on how many credits you study for in each semester. So be sure to check the bursar's office webpage of that university, and you'll get like a PDF and an estimate of your entire sort of study expenses. And there'll usually be a calculator or something that will allow you to enter in your which semester you're starting in, how many credits you plan to take per semester and everything, and that'll give you sort of an estimate of your tuition expenses and living expenses. So be sure to check that as well. And coming to funding, there are a lot of scholarship opportunities when you're applying as well. So most applications have a section especially for scholarships where they may ask you to upload a letter or something stating why you think you deserve that scholarship or why you require that scholarship to be able to pursue graduate studies. So that is where you can present your case in order to be eligible for a scholarship. And US comparatively is slightly difficult to get complete funding unless your profile is extremely exceptional, that too for international students. So, but yeah, it is extremely possible to get partial funding. And even after you get admitted, your international student office of the university will be sending you resources for scholarship opportunities even after you're admitted and before you join the university. So if you require any of that, be sure to reach out to them because they are normally very helpful and they sort of reply immediately. So that shouldn't be an issue to find scholarship opportunities. And yeah, finally, another thing that most people do, especially international students, is look for teaching assistantships or research assistantships under different professors. I think they pay you around $10 an hour and you work for 20 hours a week or something like that. So I think in a semester, it comes up to around $800 to $1,000. So though it may not cover your tuition expenses and everything as such, it will certainly help reduce the living expenses. But yeah, do make sure to check what are the requirements for that TA and RA position and whether you would be able to put in that work, extra 20 hours of work every week. But yeah, that is a good alternative to sort of, earn money that you can spend on other things and probably reduce financial burden. So yeah, that's the major overlook for the US.
Okay, now I'll speak about Canada. So, in the US, there are the top 5 colleges for most programs in Canada. So this is a University of Toronto, University of British Columbia, University of Alberta, McGill, and Waterloo. So like these five are very old and like they've been around for a long time, so they have a lot of resources. So that's why like for most programs, these five are the top ones in Canada. Now, of course, there'll be some variations for some relatively new programs or something. Uh, like it says here, there are at least 10 more well-reputed ones, and then the ranking depends on your specific program. So for that, you can check out general rankings first, and then after that, you should look into the program more directly by going to their websites or maybe like reaching out to the admissions committee or something. So that comes in the shortlisting part. Now the thing about Canada is it's relatively easier to stay in the country after graduation. So as compared to the US, like especially now, like Siddharth had said, it had become kind of tough to get the H1 visa after graduating. But in Canada, it's usually like you get a study permit. Let's say your course is for 2 years. So after that, you can stay another 2 years while working, and after that, it's relatively easier to get a work permit. So the length that you can stay after is the same amount as your initial degree. Now, the Canada is also generally cheaper than the US for both living and tuition, but it's still very expensive. So there are like three different types of programs. So the first is the thesis programs. Now these are not as cheap as the ones in the not as expensive as the ones in the US, and they're likely to be funded because when you're doing a thesis, they expect you to also like Siddharth said, apply for TA-ship or RA-ship. So that's where your funding comes from, along with some minor scholarships. But the bulk of your funding will come from the work you put in as a teaching assistant or a research assistant. Now, it's just not a good source of income. It's also like good for your profile if you do one of these activities. So in general, that's why thesis programs are good. And it's also why thesis programs are more competitive to get into because there's like a limited amount of funding that the department has. And then they have obviously less number of seats. Now, an alternative to this is course-based ones. These cost the same as thesis ones, except you don't have to do a thesis. It's just you take a bunch of courses and they're really more geared towards people who don't want to do research. There's no thesis component, and usually the teaching assistant and research assistant positions are not given to these students. But it is easier to get into, and the job opportunities afterwards are more or less the same. Because once you have a master's degree, it doesn't really matter. Like the employer is not going to ask you if you did a thesis one or a course-based one, because at the end of the day, you have the same degree. Now, after this, also there's professional programs. Now, these are specifically geared towards people that are like, it's technically geared towards people who are already working, and then they want to increase their skill set. So usually they prefer people with some work experience. And in general, these cost much more than normal ones. Like it's comparable to the amounts in the US. So professional programs are very expensive, but they are like specifically geared to people who want to go into industry afterwards. Yeah, now the main things, like one of the main differences between Canada and the US is even though the US, like the northern regions get cold, Canada gets much colder than the US because it's further north. So if you're like looking at location-based differences, this is one of the major things, weather. And like I said, living expenses, it's not that much cheaper than the US. Like some cities like Toronto, for example, has very high like living expenses, just like something like you would have in New York or something. It's very expensive to live there. But other places like let's say in Montreal or something would be a bit cheaper. So that again depends on where the location is. Yeah, I think that's it for Canada.
Okay, so let's start talking about the United Kingdom. So this is one place where not a lot of Indians were applying at a point because it was very, very hard to get a job and there was no visa opportunities after you finished your course. But it has changed recently. So a lot of people are now looking at the United Kingdom. So some of the top colleges, I'm sure everyone's aware of, like Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial College London. Then there's University of Manchester, UCL London, University of Edinburgh, Cranfield University, etc. So again, both of them said, the ranking will vary according to the program that you want to apply to. But one major difference that has come in the last 2 years is that now it's relatively easier to stay in the country after graduation for work. So you will get a work visa for, I think it is about 2 years or 1.5 years after you complete your program. The biggest plus point of going to the United Kingdom is that it's only a 1-year MSc programs, and because it's a 1-year program, it is very, very intensive. So there are no breaks in the middle, there are no holidays, there are no vacations. It is very, very intense, and you keep on there are like, I think there are only 2 semesters, or it might be divided into 3, and then a lot of coursework has to go into it. And if you have a thesis, then that is even more difficult because you have to complete a thesis in like 4 months. And with the thesis, you even have some more courses. So it completely depends on the university that we've gotten into. But overall, even if you look at the tuition, it is much more cheaper than the US in terms of tuition. And the living expenses are also somewhat lower. And if you look at the long term thing, because it's only 1 year, so you'll technically be spending a lot less money than a 2 year program, and you'll start working sooner. So that is one of the biggest plus points of going to the UK. Funding is difficult because, again, as I said, because the programs are so intensive, there are very less number of TA or RA kind of opportunities in the UK. But there is no GRE requirement, and for a lot of colleges and a lot of good colleges, there are no application fee as well. So because you don't really require a lot of, like, there are no very, as we call them, prerequisites. So those are not required, so you can easily apply to them early on. The other thing is that there are no fixed deadlines for most colleges. So you can apply right now, or you can apply by December or even April next year. So they are just completely dependent on the number of seats they have left for the course. So for UK, I would suggest, if anyone is looking to apply to the UK, there's an organization called SIUK. So they work for free. They would not charge you anything, and they'll help you apply to these colleges in the UK. The only downside, I would say, is that there is an overall decrease in the number of opportunities due to Brexit. And because it's no more in the European Union, you cannot go to Europe to find jobs. So you will only be eligible for opportunities that are there in UK at that particular time. Moving on. So Europe is one place where a lot of people are applying now these days. So the work visa situation varies with country, but for most countries, you will get about 18 months of, I think they call it job seekers visa in most places. And again, this procedure for all of this depends according to the colleges. So a lot of these colleges, the top colleges in the Europe include ETH Zurich, which is in Switzerland, EPFL, TU Delft, TU Munich, KTH Sweden, RWT Chaffen, and many others. And again, this varies with the kind of programs that you want to apply to. GRE might be applicable for some programs. For example, I know for a fact that TU Delft, which is in Netherlands, requires the GRE for aerospace engineering programs. So depending on how selective the program has become over time, GRE might be required. But the overall tuition and living expenses are much more lower in Europe as when we compare them to, say, something like US or something. The selection procedure, this is why the selection procedure for most of the programs is very competitive, and the scholarships become even more competitive. So I'm sure everybody knows that some countries like Germany and Norway have no tuition fees, and most of these colleges in fact have no application fee as well, just like the UK. So you can apply for free. But for countries like Germany, Netherlands, and maybe even Belgium and Italy, you might need to learn a new language. So that increases your chances of getting a job after graduation. That is a tedious process, but a lot of people do prefer that. Then some applications might get complicated. For example, for Germany, a lot of colleges have given off their responsibility of processing the applications to an organization called UniAssist. And a lot of these colleges do not have English support on their portals, so that might become difficult. But overall, the procedure is very much similar to the US and the UK and Canada. The bigger difference that I would say for Europe and UK would be that to submit your LORs, you do not need to send an email to a professor. You can directly upload PDFs. So that is one place where this becomes a little easier. So we'll move on to the documents required. Chinta?
Yeah, so when you're applying, you'll need to have sort of these documents in hand that the university will require. So I'd say some universities do accept, like, because you'll be applying before you get your degree and everything, obviously they will accept transcripts up to the 6th or 7th semester. And some of them do accept the unofficial transcripts. So stuff like taken from the portal, like WSDC and everything. but some of them do require official transcripts. So you'll have to get in touch with the administration office in college and sort of get your official transcripts mailed to you at the moment. But if you do go back to college, then that becomes a whole lot easier. And yeah, next it is the two exams, including the IELTS or TOEFL, whichever one you prefer, and the GRE, which is optional based on the program. So yeah, again, do check that because whether it's required or not. So you'll need to have your scores ready by the time you're applying. And they do accept when you sort of upload the PDFs while applying. But later on, you'll have to send the scores directly from ETS, as we said before. And yeah, passport, they do require your passport details, which is the major government ID that they ask for. So in case you do not have a passport yet and you're planning to apply, so do make sure to get that sorted out. And yeah, they, apart from your college transcripts, some of them also do ask for early education transcripts as well. So that includes your 10th and your 12th grade sheets. So for that, I think mostly even an unofficial one is fine. That isn't something that they're too picky about. And then the migration or school leaving certificate that you need to give to the university. And yeah, the SOP, LOR, and CV, which we'll be discussing now in detail. So, some universities even require you to give a sort of proof of funding document, which could be either like your bank statement or a statement stating that your family or your parents are able or financially able or willing to support your education for whatever duration it is. And that is still an optional thing that some universities require. So do make sure to check in the program page whether they do require that while applying. Yeah, so now we'll talk about, as we said, probably the most important part of your entire application, which is the SOP, LOR, and your CV. The SOP is what is known as the statement of purpose, or also called the letter of motivation, depending on the university. And even though you might have a very good GPA, you could have a 9-pointer and you could have a couple of projects and internships and everything. If your SOP isn't convincing enough or compelling enough to the admissions committee, you may not get an admission. So this is where it sort of, you have to state your case as to why you think you are a good fit for that program, why you want to pursue that, and what are your overall career ambitions and what you've done so far to sort of make you fit for that program. And just in case your profile isn't as strong, be it maybe like me, you have like a slightly lower GPA, then it sort of allows you to explain why that was the case and what you sort of did apart from your core academics in college to sort of make up for that, and why that sort of additional experience or knowledge that you have sort of mitigates the low GPA and puts you in a better position than another candidate who has a higher GPA than you. So make sure to sort of like weave a story around it as to why you think you are suitable for that program. So do include your achievements, any projects that you've done, and what you've learned from that, which would make you a good fit for that program and that university. And yeah, as we said, highlight what you want to do in the short term, which could be over the next 2 years during the program. And even after the program, what are your long-term career ambitions and what sort of career you want to have once you've completed your education. And be sure to like be specific. Don't beat around the bush too much. Come to the point and highlight those important points through your experiences in school and college. And though you can have a basic sort of framework that is in place for your SOP, do sort of tailor it and make tiny changes to it based on the university and the program, because some universities have a prompt that they give you on the application page. So it might say to highlight only your academic achievements and nothing else, or some universities would like to know why you think you're a fit for this program, and they may have a separate sort of academic SOP or something like that. So even though you have a basic framework, do like keep toying around with it and make a few changes for different universities and programs based on what they require. And yeah, once you've sort of written your SOP, do make sure to get different people to sort of review it. It can be your parents, it can be a group of friends that you're close to. Get each one of them to read it individually and sort of give you feedback as to what they think of it and how it could be better, or even just to like go through like grammatical errors or spelling mistakes, because it might seem small, but at the end of the day that may also portray a different picture of you to the admissions committee. So do make sure to get loads of people to sort of read your SOP and give you feedback on that. And yeah, don't like sort of plagiarize or take any content from websites that you see online. So we'd suggest first sort of putting down your own journey into the SOP, and then maybe once you've done your first draft, then you can maybe sort of look at other samples to maybe tweak it a little. But yeah, don't plagiarize or copy any of the content online, because they will get to know. And keep it as original and genuine as possible, because at the end of the day, they're looking for candidates who, as cliche as this may sound, they want to see candidates who are passionate about that subject and will be a good fit for the university. So I think the SOP is something that you should spend time on, even if it takes you a few weeks or a month or so. Do get it right. Do make sure that you're able to convey your message and why you believe that you are a good candidate and why the university should accept you. So make sure to have a compelling case and weave a story around that. Yeah.
Okay, now coming to the letters of recommendation. So most universities will ask for 3 letters. Now these can come from professors that have taught you, or professors you've done like projects with. Like they either want academic ones or professional ones. So academic ones have to necessarily come from a professor, and then the professional ones can be from your internship manager, or if you have some work experience, then your manager there. So any supervisor you had. Now, the thing is, most places will specify if they want academic ones or professional ones. So you necessarily have to stick to that. So if they say they want 3 academic ones, you have to get them from 3 professors. Now, most places, except I think like Abdus had said Europe, they will ask you for the referee's email address, and then they have to directly upload the letter. Now, the thing is, in our college, most of the professors won't write the letter for you themselves. Like, at least they'll ask you for initial draft. So you'll probably have to draft it, send them the letter, and then they'll change it how they need to, depending on what they want to say. And then they'll upload it themselves. So you have no idea what they're actually going to upload. So that's why it's very important. You pick people you trust. Like, you know that this professor, you have to know that the professor is like nice, to put it in a simple way. And the thing is, the professor has to know you, like, because the letter recommendation, if it's very bland and if it's very like non-personal, then the admissions committee will can easily read that out, and they'll just see like, oh, this professor just writing some generic stuff about this student, so we're not really learning much about him. So the key thing here is to pick a professor that you know, and ideally it would be a professor that you've done a project under, because then they can speak to your ability to actually perform, like on a project. So that's what. So the preference would be a professor that you have worked with in a project, or even if the course had a big assignment or something, you can spin that as a project. And then it would be a professor that is nice, and they know you and you performed well in their course. And then if you really need to, then you can just pick a third professor that you performed well in their course, because the thing is, most, like, when you submit your transcripts to the university, they can see that you got this grade. So just the professor saying that, oh, the student received an S grade in my class is not enough. If it's really necessary, then like if you have no other options, then it's fine. Then you can add some other stuff about that to your personality and stuff. But ideally, the letter of recommendation should show the committee how good you can work, and it should be like like it says in the name, they're basically the professor is recommending you for this program, and they want to know why they're recommending you. Right now, so yeah, there's a tip here because, like I said, most professors will ask you to write the letter yourself. You should try to get different people to write the LOR for you. Like if you have that option, like let's say you get one of your friends to write it for you, because if you write all three yourself, then the writing style will be very similar, and the admissions committee might get to know, and then it just looks strange that all three professors have the same writing style. Now, again, like we said for the SOP, do not copy someone's LOR, because obviously you can take like some key phrases, such as exceptional student works well under pressure. But for the most of it, do not plagiarize it, because if they get to know that the letter is plagiarized, they won't think that you copied it from somewhere. They'll think that this professor doesn't really care about you, and they just took one of their old letters and just sent it as is. So that won't really help your application at all. Yeah, and the key thing that it should do is mention your strengths, and like I said, it is ideally come from a professor that you've done some work under. So, for example, if you're applying in your final year, then you'll probably have a final year project guide. So that can be one person. Now, the thing is, they won't. By the time you apply, mostly they won't have. You won't have a complete project done. So what they'll say is about how they think the project is going, how you work, and if they think the project will be successful. And that is like that's a good letter basically. If they say that if they highlight your good qualities and then they say that I think this project will be successful or something like that. So that's one good letter. Another one can be from some professor you've done a big assignment under, for example. Yeah, and that's it for the letters. But one other thing, so after you're done with your applications, after you get an admission decision, be sure to let your letter recommenders know. So, and then just thank them also for their time, because they're taking, like, it may not seem like a lot to just send one letter for you, but most programs will also ask them to fill out a form, sort of, to like rank you. They'll give them like a form that has like, let's say, 5 options for each question. So like they'll have to compare you to their previous students. So that takes a lot of time for them. So just as a courtesy to them, you should thank them after you're done. Next slide of this. Yeah, right. So now the CV. So like Chinta had said, the SOP should highlight your major accomplishments, and it should be woven into a story. Now, this is because you're sending your CV, and this has all of your achievements on it, like your biggest achievements in college or something. So instead of just listing your achievements in your SOP, you would rather list them in your CV. And then in your SOP, you should explain how these achievements have shaped what you want to study and why you want to study that. So like in the CV, you would highlight, since you're applying to an educational program, this is an academic CV. So the first thing you would want on there is education. And if you have a like really good, like a 9-pointer GPA, then of course add it there. But it's not necessary. Like it's just to add an extra detail. And then if you've gotten any other awards or achievements or scholarships or something like that, then you can add that as well. So if you have the space, then you can also add your high school, and then the same thing for them. Like if you had really good grades, and if you had any other awards or achievements. Next comes work experience, and then you should start that from the most recent, and then also include the dates that you worked there. So like this also includes like internships or stuff you've done in college. Like let's say if you worked at Quiz Club or something, let's say, then that also counts as work experience. Right. Next thing is research experience. Now this, if you have any publications or if you have any presentations at conferences, then you should definitely add that on like right after work experience, because when you're going for masters, like research experience really helps your case. After that comes major projects, courses, and MOOCs. So if you don't have any publications, then you can highlight your major projects like much more. After that, you can highlight courses and MOOCs. So in a professional CV, you would not find these things. Like you especially wouldn't find courses and MOOCs, let's say. But because it's an academic CV, like it's expected that like it's good to have your entire profile on your CV so that they can easily read it instead of going to your transcript and then individually reading each one. After that, you can add your skills. Let's say if you're in computer science, then you can add programming or softwares that you know, and then like these are spoken languages that you know, and then some hobbies also you can add, and also volunteer work. If you have some volunteer work, it's very good to add that on your CV. It shows initiative, and it's also like the admissions committee appreciates like volunteer work on the CV. Like it's a good idea to have it. After that, if you have the space, then you can add your references just to like fill up some space. Now, this seems like a lot for one page. So that's the thing. For an academic CV, especially if you have the publications or like if you have lots of projects, then it can be 2 pages. Like there's no restriction. Like usually when you look at professional CV, it necessarily has to be 1 page because the HR people don't have time to read. But the admissions committee, they have all the time in the world to read your application. So it's a good idea to make it 2 pages if you can. But if you don't have enough to go over, let's say 1.5 pages, then try to restrict it to 1 page. And yeah, that's it for the CV.
Okay, so for this particular side, we're just trying to highlight the kind of expenses that you can expect in like different countries. So this is just a range of, everything that we've come across during our research of colleges and the kind of tuitions that we can expect. This is just a range of what you can expect. So for example, in the US, you can expect about, for the 2 years that you're there, you can expect a expenditure of about 40 to 65 lakhs. For Europe, for example, in countries as I mentioned, that Germany, Norway have no tuition fee, and you just have to pay a minimal semester enrollment fee. So it can range from somewhere around 70 to 50 lakh rupees for the paid courses. For Canada, it's similar. It's about 16 to 54 lakhs, and the same goes for the UK. But for the UK, it is only a 1 year course. So if you look at it, it seems expensive, but because you're only studying for 1 year, it is a lot cheaper than any of the other countries. So moving on, I'll talk about scholarships. So a lot of different scholarships are available out there. So different types of scholarships are need-based. Then there's merit-based scholarship, course and college-specific scholarships, and then you get funding by different organizations. And there's another type of scholarship called loan scholarships. So for scholarships that are given out by organizations, there are many pages. Like there's an app called Yockit, and there's a Grad Cafe. There are also a lot of Reddit threads about scholarships that people are applying to. So because we are international students, we'll have to definitely check if we are eligible for them. So one of the biggest scholarship opportunities would be when you are applying to particular university. You can check out their scholarship page and look at international student scholarships on that particular university's website. So that is one of the biggest sources where you can find how many scholarships you can apply for. And most of these scholarships might require a different application than the one you've put in for your program. But many of these universities, like the University of Melbourne, automatically considers you for about 50 odd scholarships that are available to Indian students. So that is something that will depend completely on the university that you're applying to. Another way to find these scholarships and bursaries is by emailing the course coordinator. So on all the course websites, course pages on the university's websites, you will have an email for a particular course coordinator or some person who is basically in charge of handling all the queries about the course. So you can always email them, or you can email some professors about opportunities like TA, RA, as Siddharth and Rudraksh had mentioned. So this email, you would not expect people in India usually to reply to your email, especially because they're so busy. But because these people are they've been hired to do this particular job, they are there to solve all your queries. They will get back to you in about a week or so, and they will definitely let you know about all the funding opportunities that are available for that particular program or for that particular university. So one point is that scholarships are obviously very, very competitive. So if you require another letter of motivation, be sure to draft a different SOP for scholarships, because they would not really, it's usually shorter than the SOP that we put in for programs, and it requires a different kind of approach. So make sure that you have a different SOP for scholarships as well. The next, I have mentioned some of the scholarships that are available for Indian students. So for the UK, there's a Commonwealth scholarship that gives you complete funding, including living expenses for studies in the UK. There's a GN Tata Endowment Scholarship, which is a loan scholarship of up to, I think, 10 lakh rupees for Indian students. There's a KC Mahindra Loan Scholarship, which I think is a scholarship of about 4 to 8 lakh rupees. There's a GSEP scholarship, which is, I think it is only applicable for courses that are related to sustainable development. Another point that you need to make sure you understand about scholarships is that a lot of these scholarships might require you to come back to your home country for a minimum amount of like a year or two after you complete your course. So that is something that you need to look at. Then there's Erasmus Mundus joint master's degrees. These are conducted over a few colleges in Europe. and they're completely free of cost. Then there's Australia Awards, scholarships and fellowships. There's the British Chevening scholarships, but I think this requires work experience, so that we fresher students might not be eligible for this. Then there's a KTH Sweden India scholarship that Indian students are eligible for at KTH Sweden. There's a Melbourne School of Engineering scholarship. So these were a few scholarships that I found during my application period. But again, I told you, you can email your course coordinators and all these people and find out a lot more about these scholarships. Okay, Siddharth will take over.
Yeah, so lastly, probably the thing that most people overlook is the networking aspect of the application process. Once you've submitted your application, or even before you start your application, you sort of want to understand and speak to people that have gone through this process and the program and have experience at the university, and sort of understand what you'll be getting into. So LinkedIn, Yocket, and Grad Cafe, these are three websites that are very good for networking with people in the university. On LinkedIn, you can enter the course name or the university name, and you'll definitely find hundreds of alumni that have gone there recently or even a few years ago and are now working. So you can connect with them and sort of ask your questions. So I sort of entered the course names and found a few people, two people from each university, and sort of messaged them, and they were like more than glad to sort of help out, talk about what are the research opportunities, what are the job opportunities like, what is the student life like around the university, what are things to do in your free time outside of the class and stuff like that, because that is also an important aspect of it. So they are quite helpful on LinkedIn. And you will find a lot of international students in most universities, especially from India and the subcontinent and everything. So you'll probably be able to sort of relate to their experience more, and they can help you with that. Again, Yocket is and Grad Cafe are two other websites that have multiple discussion forums with people who are currently in master's programs or who graduated. And so if you have any question, you can sort of put it up there. There are already quite a few discussions regarding the process or about life at the university. So it's not difficult to really get some answers from them. Another resource that isn't mentioned on the slide, but I sort of found helpful was there are a few subreddits called Grad Admissions and I think Grad Student Life or something like that. So Grad Admissions, it's entirely like people from all over the world asking questions about programs and universities and visa queries and stuff like that. So that is quite a helpful resource to have. And there are a lot of student ambassadors as well that are in those subreddits. So if you are sort of referring to a particular university and what the program is like, you'll definitely find people who can at least refer you to someone they know, and you'll be able to get your answers from there as well. So do make sure to check out these resources even before you start applying to sort of understand what the universities and programs are like. And yeah, so before you dive too deep into it, do make sure to understand what life would be like. And when you are reaching out to people, do tell them what you're applying for, which course and what you plan to do. And even if you don't get into that university particularly, you might have a connection that you could use in the future, someone that you know in a particular industry or a company or something like that. So this is a great way to network for future jobs or your future career as well. And yeah, if you go to your program websites or the university websites, you'll find student ambassadors for different things. They may be an ambassador for your particular course or department, or they may be an international student ambassador, and they can sort of help you out with any questions you have regarding, say, funding or visa or how to apply for a TA-ship or even housing or stuff like that. And so that sort of helps you find people and connections before you even get to the university. So that is, again, a good resource to look at. So yeah, that's it from us. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or ask, and we'll be happy.
Yeah,
I think there's already a question.
Yeah, one question is there. Okay,
Yeah,
so
how recent-
Piyusha,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I'll just take it. Yeah, so basically, most programs would want your letter to be dated within 1 year of applying. But if you knew the person, let's say maybe if it's a work like a manager or something, then if you know them 3 years ago, I think that's also okay. But more than 3 years would be excessive, I think. But the letter should be dated within 1 year.
Yeah, and if it's from a professor, it should ideally be somebody who's taught you after first year. So maybe somebody who's
Yeah.
taught you in your core area. So maybe like second, third year is fine. But I think first year would be quite a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, exactly. Because it should be someone related to your program, basically.
If anyone else has any questions, you can put it in the chat box. Yeah. Or unmute yourself and just let us know.
National coordinator of a program I trained in before final year in college. So how long ago did you graduate then? Oh, lol, first year, okay. National coordinator program I trained in. I think it might be fine if you don't have a professor that is related to your exact program, and if you're like out of options, then I feel like if this national coordinator knows you really well and like can speak to your ability, I think that might be okay. But just I would suggest try to get someone in your program. And like, yeah, maybe someone who is like who taught you more recently, maybe. But if it's not possible, then yeah, I don't think it's a bad option. Okay, there's another question.
I don't think most of us have an idea about like psychology courses.
Yeah, because all three of us are STEM, so I don't really know. But yeah, I'm not too sure. Sorry.
As I
Yes.
said, there are a lot of these questions about advanced diploma programs and everything on the subreddits. So I've seen quite a few discussion threads even over the last few weeks about programs in psychology and education and stuff like that. So, and there have been some recommendations from people who are working in universities and stuff. So I guess you could check that out, because that doesn't cover only like engineering courses as such. It covers all sort of courses. So yeah, that could be a good resource to check out.
Santosh has asked if we need like a LOR for each program and for each college we apply. Yes, I think you can apply the same. You can put in the same LOR for all of the colleges, but it would be preferred if you could just change the name of the college or maybe add the name of the college somewhere. So that would be good. But if it's not the case, then you can put in the same LOR for all the colleges that you apply.
Yeah, if you are going with the second way, like if you're not tailoring it for each college, then make sure you don't put one name. Like when you're submitting your LOR to your person, like to your professor, then make sure that has no like college name on it. Because in case the professor directly submits it as is, then they might see another college's name on that, which doesn't look really good.
So there's a question about minimum GPA requirement.
Yeah, so usually there are multiple like sort of websites that sort of convert your GPA to a 4.0 scale. Most universities do say that they require a 3 GPA, and on average it comes up to around 7 GPA, but mine was slightly lower than that, but I guess you can sort of make up for that with other things. But yeah, generally they look for around 7 GPA. So if you're around that, it's fine, I guess. There isn't much of an hassle.
So if there's a question about like changing streams. So how important is GPA? So if you want to change streams, I'd say that your work experience, the projects that you've done would matter more than your GPA. Because like if, for example, you're in chemical engineering and your GPA is lower, so, but if you have a higher GRE score and all of your work experience and projects are related to, say, machine learning or something in computer science, so that would, I think, have a more heavy weightage than, say, your GPA. So it does matter in some cases, but if you're changing your stream, I would not think that GPA would be the biggest criteria that they look at.
Yeah, and if possible, then they might, in like along with projects, they might also look at courses that you've done, like related coursework.
Yeah, that might be possible. So if you have done a lot of MOOCs related to the stream that you want to change to, that might be helpful. But
Mm.
since the courses of your undergrad are not exactly related to your master's degree, I'm not sure. I don't think that your GPA would be very, very important to that. What are your
Right.
opinions on going for masters after like working for a few years? Well, it
Uh,
depends again. Yeah, you want to take that with us?
I mean, I guess it's a good option. If you're working for a few years, then you get work experience, which definitely boosts your application. And if you are going for like a professional program or something, or like a course-based one, then there's no problem. It's in fact good because you might be able to save up some funds or something. And it again, like I said, it boosts your application. But if you are going for a thesis-based program, then I would say in that, while you're working, you should also definitely try to do some research on the side, like maybe work with a professor from NIT Warangal, because uh, because if you're applying for a thesis program, they'll ask you what you've done in those, like, let's say 2 years that you worked. What research have you done? And then if you don't have a good option, then it doesn't really look good because they would want research over just work experience. So it really depends on what kind of program you're going for.
So the other
Abdus,
thing I
anything to
would
add?
say for working for a few years is that if you think that you don't have a very strong profile, so you can build your profile by working for a few years and then start applying. But if you do plan on eventually doing an MS, I would say that you take your GRE before you get out of college, because once you are in a working environment, it's very difficult to get back to studying. So that might help you out a lot.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's a triple E student. So as you mentioned, like if you want to know about these courses, the only way that you can, find out and find out more about these courses is by looking up what these courses are about. Go to university websites and check out different courses and their modules and everything, and see what interests you most. So we can't exactly tell you like what courses you should look at, but I think that's something that you need to discover on your own.
Right. And if you are like just starting off looking at what kind of courses you want to study at, then I think it's a good idea to look at the top ranking universities and then see the basic programs that they offer, like basic courses that they offer. And then after that, you can like go into programs that are more tailored to what you want to do. Because usually the top universities will have like a lot of options, and then you can find more like easily what you want to do.
So Swarna has asked if it's a good idea to earn a master's degree online rather than pursuing it full time, like on campus. So my opinion on that is that with a master's degree abroad, the courses are not exactly what makes the experience what it is. It is more about
Hmm.
staying on campus, interacting with the professors, interacting with students from all of the world, and then eventually, if even if you want to find a job there, it's all about networking and how well you connect with others. So I think that's a bigger part than your coursework. And when it comes to like STEM programs, I would say that if you want to go into research, or if you want to carry out research, it's better to be on campus rather than being in an online environment.
Hmm. Yeah, and another thing is, if you plan to migrate for work afterwards, then it's much easier to like. It's actually like if I think Canada also, like there's a thing, if you're not on campus, and even this year during COVID, for the people that weren't on campus, the time that they studied online, not from Canada, does not count towards the visa. So they'll only like, if you do it completely online, then it'll be very hard to get a visa to work in that country later on. So if that's your plan, then I would suggest that doing it online is not such a good idea.
So he's asking if we don't know the professor quite well, then will it be awkward to ask him to write or send the LOR to different colleges once we apply. So
Yeah.
in my case, I don't think the professor usually gets irritated, but if he does, then there are a lot of other professors that have taught you, so you can like have one
Mhm.
professor send it to three universities and then have the other professor send it to, say, the other 3 or 4 universities that you've applied to. So that is
Yeah.
something that you can do.
And another good idea is like it might be a double-edged sword because then it gives them the option of giving a limit. But basically, for me, what happened was one of my professors, I had asked him first only, like I asked him if he can send LORs. And then when I started applying to 10 colleges, after the sixth one, he said, do not give my name anymore to any of the other colleges. So at that point, I had to like find a professor really late on, and it was kind of difficult. So I would suggest like it might be a good idea, especially if it's a senior ranking professor, to like ask them upfront like how many LORs they'd be comfortable giving you. and then you can accordingly like look for alternatives if once their quota is done.
And the other thing would be, I would not suggest you to get an LOR from a person you don't quite know that well. It would obviously be better if you know them really well. So
Yeah, and if you know them really well, then it also gives them like incentive to write it for you.
Exactly. So many people have said that packages post MS don't increase much. How much truth is there in this? So I like it would depend. So if you convert everything into INR, I would say that it does increase a lot, but it depends completely on where you're going, what kind of courses you're doing, and what kind of job you land at the end.
Yeah, exactly. The main thing is the opportunities will be more than if you like depends on how like if you're lucky enough to get those opportunities or if you're lucky enough to land them. But yeah, in like generally the opportunities would be more once you have a higher degree.
And I think most people, the motivation behind pursuing a master's is not the money is not the major motivation, I would say, for most people. It is more about finding the right research environment or finding the right kind of place where you can showcase your talents in the right way, I guess.
Yeah, that's also true.
If you have any other questions, you can also unmute and speak up. That's also fine. Or you can put it in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll just end the seminar here, the webinar. Okay, so do opportunities increase if you come back to India once you have an MS? So my experience with that has been that in India, a lot of for the more technical jobs, you do require a master's degree. So I would say, yeah, they would increase a lot if you come back to India, but it wouldn't be as good as it would have been where you got your master's degree. But yeah, it would in general would increase once you come back to India after having a master's degree.
Tying back with the previous question, based on like experience that I've seen from like cousins and stuff who had to come back, yeah, it does. You do sort of get even like better paying jobs as compared to say doing an MS here and then applying for a job. So yeah, the opportunities are slightly more once you come back.
More than the opportunities, I would say that what helps more is that you get to work in the area that you actually want to work in. So that is the reason why most people anyways pursue an MS. So I think that way it will help you out a lot, even if you come back to India. Okay, that is a tricky question. So he's asking if
that is something we didn't exactly have to go through because we sort of knew them from second and third year. But I guess maybe this goes against every intuition of an engineering student, but like be active in online classes. I guess that would help. And yeah, even after class, don't just like in an offline environment, like sort of interact with them. And most of them are ready to sort of give you their even personal emails or phone numbers so you can sort of message them on WhatsApp and stuff. At least that was the case for us, where professors were quite welcoming that way.
Absolutely, I would agree. Most professors would not have a huge issue with giving you an LOR as long as they've taught you something, and they know that you've been a part of the class and you have not been absent, like you're a regular student. All of that does factor in for a lot of professors. So if you're a regular student, you have a decent GPA or something, and you have interacted with them like a few times, that I think that's good enough to get an LOR.
Right.
I think we've already addressed this. Like, it depends again. If you feel like you have a strong profile, then it would be beneficial for you to go right after your BTech. But if you feel like you're not sure if you want to work in that field, or you want to further increase your profile, and you feel like you might not make it to the top colleges right after BTech, then it's better to get some job work gigs and then apply. I guess that is it for the questions. So we'll be sharing this particular slide with you, which has I'll actually be sharing a link for a drive folder on the group that I've made on WhatsApp, and that will contain this particular slide and all of the resources that we've gathered, which includes study material for GRE and the spreadsheets that we've made, and it also includes our CV, so you have like a general idea of what a CV should look like. So this is a list of important websites, and we have our contact details here. We all prefer if you just email us rather than WhatsApp or anything else. And the links are also in the slide. So yeah, I think that's it then. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's
I'll
it.
just stop the recording.
Yeah, you're welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Thanks for attending this.